What is up, boys and girls? So we are now at our last challenge drawing, and that will be the last part of this course that we'll be doing with pen and ink study. It's going to be a little bit of a more of a challenging drawing just because the medium is a little bit new, but the approach that you're going to take with this medium is going to be very similar to the way we approached rendering value with pencil, by laying over marks and building that density to create that three-dimensional feel. In the syllabus, I think I advised everybody to get the Micron pens. These are from Sakura, and their line is called Pigma. So if you're sticking with Microns, just get a 0.5 and a 0.8, and those are going to be sufficient to complete the study. It's not too fine that the nib is going to be super sharp, that will require you to do a lot of mark making, but it's also not going to be too thick where you kind of feel like you're not going to have enough control. With that said, it's always a good idea, as I always try to encourage you to do the warm-ups in your sketchbooks. Again, simply because that is the best way to get acquainted with the material. It's the best way to kind of get your hand moving and get past that initial fear, but also is to understand how you can control the mark making in order to build that form by following the form the same way we did with the pencil drawing, starting with the most basic geometric shapes. So in the next segment, I'm going to walk you through a few of those ways that you can use a pen to build value, and how we can follow form, starting with simple shapes that you can practice on for about, I would say, 15 to 20 minutes in your sketchbooks, and then moving on to the longer study that's going to be your final study, and that's it. So for the final study, we're going to draw a shoe. You can pick any shoe. You can get something like more of an athletic sneaker. I'm gonna actually draw this old sneaker of mine that I haven't worn for a while, but they're kind of worn out, but they got a lot of characters in them. So this is gonna be the demo today. It's just a high top Converse old sneaker. I do advise to use those and just let them kind of hang, place them on the surface so that it has some kind of interest. Yes, it might be a little bit intimidating to draw shoelaces because there's a lot of detail and they're intertwined and so forth, but don't be too threatened by the initial complexity. Basically, you're gonna work with, let's see, within your larger format. So your shoe is gonna end up being, about, I would say, at least a foot wide or long, and depending on what kind of shoe you select. So get creative, draw whatever shoe you like. Could be anything, could be a sandal, could be a dress shoe, or maybe even some kind of boot. Just be conscious of how long it's gonna be and the way you would compose it. Same way we're gonna do it with a little thumbnail. Once we jump to the longer study, locate your composition, figure out how you want to compose it. If you want to do several thumbnails, do several thumbnails. That way you will flash out all those ideas right away. Spend 5-10 minutes tops on the thumbnail stage, and then jump to the very loose sketch with the pencil. All right, so we'll begin with just a few simple shapes, just to kind of show you how you can use something like a pen and ink approach when we try to build that form. As always, I like to start with just simple spheres and figure out how I can build value around something as simple as a sphere, and then we'll do a quick study of a cylinder and maybe a few other basic shapes. But just gonna block it in so you can kind of get a sense where that sphere is, and I'll start with my 0.5. So there's a few things to keep in mind. one thing that I would like to mention is probably figuring out the enclosed shapes. So you can kind of approach initially describing the shape you see by outlining it. And it doesn't have to be a perfect continuous line. So for me right now, I'm just trying to kind of figure out where that sphere is, because I'm not a computer. I can't quite draw a perfect sphere from the first attempt. So just trying to kind of figure it out. And you may notice the pace that I'm taking right now. The pace with the pen requires you to probably slow down a lot more than perhaps when you work with pastel or something a little bit more fluid, where it's more forgiving and gives you a lot more room to make mistakes and also correct them. With the pen, because the nature of the medium and such, that correcting is going to be a lot more difficult unless you're using perhaps something like this, which is not ideal, and I'm not advising anybody to use any whiteout liquid or sticky tape. So again, we're gonna pretend our light is gonna travel perhaps a little bit in the front of the sphere, not towards the back, from maybe this angle here. That's the direction of the light. With that said, as before, kind of locate your cast shadow in your sketchbooks as a warm-up exercise. And with the pen, even though this particular ink, archival ink, dries quite fast, it's still advisable to move from left to right when you're working through your composition and you're rendering with a pen, for those people who are righties, because otherwise you're going to be smudging. As far as holding, obviously we're not doing gesture or loose sketch. In the beginning with the pencil, please hold your pencil with overhand grip, the same way we did before. But with the pen, it's going to require a little bit more control. So again, I'm gonna try to follow the form. And basically just build small marks that kind of follow the form. Instead of trying to block this entire area that's going to be shaded, I prefer to go in little sections. So it's much easier to go in small sections like so. And kind of try to follow the form. And also be mindful of how densely you pack your strokes. So as you see here, you begin to notice that by altering the density with which I apply the pen strokes, it begins to mimic the conditions of the lighting, even though it's quite imaginary here. I don't have an actual sphere in front of me or anything like that, but simply by spacing my marks around, the eye begins to kind of discern the three-dimensional shape. So if you want to increase the value, or as we learned by now, to push that value down, what you can do is you can go over a certain area, and instead of following the same direction of strokes, you could probably alternate the direction and instead do a little bit of cross-hatching and kind of follow the shape of the form. or the form of the shape. I'm not actually sure which way, but getting section by section of the small parallel marks is usually the most basic way to go about it. It's the most traditional way to build value. Once you kind of get the hang of it, you'll probably increase the speed a little bit when you get a little comfortable with seeing which area needs to be pushed down or shaded more and which area should be left untouched. And then if you really want to get even darker value, go with another layer of marks. And always try to follow the form. I'm not actually doing the best job here right now, but this is that core shadow we talked about in the very beginning of that section. And then obviously you can block the cast shadow here. Get right there on the edge where the contrast is, that sharp transition edge we talked in Unit 4 about when we try to tackle the high contrast value study and the reflective surface. And as you can see what I'm doing right now, I'm kind of fading my shading by simply making the marks more and more sparse rather than packing them with cross-hatching. Getting right there in that, right underneath the object where the shadow is darker, to create a little bit more value. Perhaps add a little bit of a phased out layer here, since the light is coming from kind of the front. So if we use the same light logic and try to sketch something like a cylinder, I'm just gonna show it right next to it. So let's say the light is still coming this way. The light is still coming this way, and I don't even really need the pencil. Just gonna the same principles apply. No matter what you draw, the light is gonna travel around the form. So cylinder is another great example, simple example to try and render for about 10 minutes with the pen. Perhaps pretend there's some kind of surface that it's sitting on. Just a very simple little challenge drawing. Wouldn't even call it challenge drawing. Challenge drawing is going to be the shoe, but this is more of just a fun little warm-up. Shadow traveling from here a little bit backwards. You can even just draw like a simple mug that has something like this kind of shape and try to render a mug or any mundane object. So especially with the pen, it applies to any study, any exercise, especially for those who want to take their drawing skills to the next level after we finish with our basic course. A good rule of thumb is just to draw any sort of mundane object that you see around your house or maybe outside. Small objects that you can place right in front of you, something like an eraser, even this bottle, and just draw from life a quick 15-20 minute study. That's the way you're gonna learn, the fastest way and the most surest way you're gonna learn how to render it. Also, just an idea for those who also are curious about what you can do with pen and ink, which is not required for the long study. You could use either like a refillable Crockwell pen. Same principle, same approach with working, just a slightly different way of the liquidity or the fluidity rather of the ink. They come in this kind of sort of cartridges that either refillable, or you can just buy a pack of like 10 and not worry about the bottle of ink. and just do quick studies of things that you can find around the house or outside. You can see what's outside your window and so forth, and just try to render them. Take your time with it and just build the value. So our light is coming this way. It's probably gonna start shading around this area, and the core shadow is gonna start from that line, if you remember, with this sphere, that sort of imaginary cross section we've talked about was around here. And I'll show the dash line to kind of get a little bit better idea of where that line is, which is why the core shadow starts here. Same thing here, but now the spherical surface is traveling this way, so the light is gonna hit same direction of light from the front, which is why I'm drawing this arrow in a three-dimensional sort of way rather than showing an arrow like that, right? That is just to give you an idea of where the light's coming from. So our core shadow will begin here. What do we do with the pen? We're gonna try to build that value by following that form. The cylinder has a nice round form to it, so parallel short bursts of marks across different sections. Perhaps I want to unite this area and push it even more further down. This is not following form ideally, but if you notice, what happens here is that where the lines overlap, it becomes to appear a lot darker. I'm leaving a little bit of light here on the back, since I'm assuming there will be some reflected light. You can go over again this way a little bit more sparse and create that transition, that fading. Since the light is coming from the top, also a little bit from the top, it may not highlight the top fully, but perhaps that far edge is gonna be slightly darker. So just gonna get there, right there up on that far edge of the top, and do a little transition here. I'm not really following the form as I'm supposed to right here, simply because the strokes got a little bit too small. I'm gonna push a little bit more right through the core shadow here with a few more marks, getting that cross-hatching. So the cast shadow starts from this point right here, so it's gonna kind of fade towards the back. And actually 0.5 is kind of thin for me. I actually like slightly larger, slightly thicker mark making. If the surface is darker, obviously, depending on what you're rendering, you can render around those shapes. And the way this object is gonna become looking three-dimensional is when there will be enough contrast between the different values, different parts of the object and its surroundings. So just observe and notice. And this, I think this marker is a little dried out. Just observe and notice what's dark and what's light. And perhaps maybe the background here was darker. If you were to really render something fully, as you're gonna be doing with the shoe, slow controlled marks, little sections of blocking. Different areas the pen may be required to put a little bit more pressure on those strokes, because it's kind of like a marker, but with a very dense felted nib, which means it's not a very free-flowing ink. So maybe I want to push the value closer to the object, make it the contrast even more pronounced. And I'm just gonna push right next to the edge and then make slow transition as I move away from it by cross-hatching. Maybe it's going to be a little lighter on this side. But I want to show a little contrast, so it's not just a line drawing. I want to show a little contrast between the object itself and the background in this simple, quick rendering. Maybe I want to even push more contrast right there towards the edge. But it's always a good rule of thumb just to stick with short bursts, small areas blocked in, and just move area by area instead of trying to cover a lot more ground by long strokes, because making sure that those lines are going to be all nice and parallel is probably going to be a lot more difficult if you go with that approach. And for the learning purposes, I think it's just easier to go with short, controlled, parallel lines, like so. If you need to go in there and like really define it, you can get in there on a line and sort of define it a little bit more. Right now, I'm just trying to create enough contrast between the background of this imaginary scene so that the cylinder itself pops, just like we addressed in all the previous studies with charcoal and with pencil. Everything sort of needs that dance of values in order to begin to look three-dimensional. Certain areas you can go a little bit more expressive, like I just did, like this. But until you kind of get comfortable after a few warm-ups, especially when it requires a little bit more precision, when you really get close to the edge to create that separation, I don't advise you to go more gestural. But for those who can kind of get the feel for it, and in certain areas you could use this medium. Of course, this is just to learn. This is more of a traditional way, but you could use it whichever way you like. So as you can see, with just a few basic separations of values throughout this transition edges that we've talked about, you can get the three-dimensional feel of just a simple object with the pen. And just to kind of show you guys the difference between how this ink would behave as opposed to Micron pen, just for fun, I don't know, maybe we can we'll do a cone. So I'm gonna start with the base. Again, no pencil for me, but if you want to do a quick underline pencil, you're more than welcome to. So I'm just gonna kind of block it in. I think my ink is all dried out. Let me see real quick. So ellipse or our circle in perspective. I'm gonna put a point here. That's the point that goes through the middle, right? Connect this point with this point, and then this with this, just to give myself a simple cone to render. That's the background of this imaginary scene. See, the flow is a little bit easier. Again, the transition into the core shadow is going to be right around here. The light is coming slightly from the front, from the top, this way. So begin by blocking in. Again, same approach, short controlled marks, moving across the form and trying to simply follow the form. Gonna create a little bit of a transition here. I'll try to speed it up for you slightly. I'm gonna darken right through this core shadow. And then cast shadow is gonna go that way. And then if you really want to go in and create that separation, you can. Also, the beauty of fountain pens like this, once you get a bit of that control over your strokes, is that you can kind of work a little bit more expressively with it, because the flow is a lot quicker rather than something like Micron pen, where it's definitely noticeable how the ink doesn't flow very quickly when you try to lay down a lot of quick marks, which means that each mark is going to be kind of dried out and it's not going to leave a lot of ink on the paper, obviously. So I'm just kind of getting a little bit more messy, a little bit more expressive, just to block in a larger area here. Cross hatch this way to build a little bit more value behind. Perhaps there'll be a little bit of shade appearing here on the curvature. I'm trying not to smudge it because this ink is takes very long to kind of dry it. So I'm gonna maybe do a little bit more transition here. Just simple little sketch like that gives you enough information to start seeing it as three-dimensional. And you could do the same thing in your sketchbook. You can also just practice with a few marks without actually trying to render anything in particular, and just get the technique down, get acquainted with what way is best to hold the pen. Obviously the Micron, let me switch back to that since that's what we're gonna use. My 08 is a little dried out, so I'm gonna try to push a little bit more on a nib to kind of get that thicker line. And without even really any shape, sometimes it's a great exercise to just alternate the direction of lines and try to build some kind of shape, just imaginary. I don't really have any idea right now what I'm drawing, but simply by practicing with some marks, you could also create interesting textures. I don't know, that mimic some kind of shape, perhaps just by the direction, changing the direction of the hatching. You could probably just try something else and just to kind of get a sense of how you can create different gradations by laying over certain marks. And this is just for me to play around again with the ink. I don't really have any specific idea of what I'm rendering here, but this is the underlying approach for whatever it is that you want to sketch. For example, this image of a skull that I sketched out last night by using a simple ballpoint pen, but the approach to building value is the same as the kind we'll be using with Micron pens. All right, now that I got my little Earl Grey going here and a little pick-me-upper, I think I'm ready to jump on a longer rendering. Speaking of teas and such, it's always a great idea to create sort of a conducive environment for you to put yourself in the right frame of mind, make yourself a little relaxed and have fun with it. So I like to make a little tea here. I'm just gonna block out the shoe very loosely with a pencil, and that's what I'm gonna start with. When I began talking about the shoe drawing and that you can pick whichever shoe you like, of course, be mindful of what you're going with. So something like a dress shoe is gonna have a lot more darker inherent value in it than perhaps like a white sneaker in my case. But it's up to you. Pick whatever you like that's got quite a bit of complexity to it. Obviously, I want to see a longer study, a little bit more rendered drawing. With the pencil sketch, very loose overall shapes. Try to find the shape as we refer to it in class. So try to just block in the main shapes first. Very, very loose in the beginning, because you're going to be drawing over that, but not rely 100% on the pencil sketch that you're going to lay down. This is just designed so that it helps you create your composition, your successful composition, figure out how you want it within that given pictorial space, right? And understand different sections of the shoe. So this is just to kind of get you jump started, so to speak, on the process of actually rendering it. So I'm not really concerned too much about getting too precise at this point. I'm just trying to block in the main shapes I see, locate everything, and most importantly, keep in mind those proportions, because I still want the shoe to look quite realistic and not be an impression of a shoe. So just about to be done with my quick pencil sketch here. At this stage, it's very easy to make corrections. I can go back and just block in slightly more form towards the back if I notice that my proportions are off, and just kind of go over it. If you want to erase certain marks at this stage you can, or if you want to lighten them up so they're not throwing you off too much, as we learned, go with that sharp edge and just kind of lighten them up slightly with the clean eraser. Go back in there and re-establish the same shapes. But what we learned in that continuous line study is going to be a good approach here. You just kind of putting the pencil down and then following the form that you see. Continuous line, great. It's the best approach you can take here, and just trying to discover different forms within the shoe that you begin to notice. Different cuts of leather perhaps, and bands of shapes. So the sole is gonna, the rubber sole kind of bends around, moves towards the back. I skipped the thumbnail sketch as I advised you to do, just because I don't want to take too much time doing the demo here. But obviously, to position your shoe within your pictorial space, depending on how you decide to go about it, whether you want to go vertical or if you want to go horizontal, slightly larger size thumbnail, about this big would be good. And just create a very loose, block in the shape very loosely, like so. You don't need any laces, you don't need anything. You just need an overall sense like that. Literally, once you get the hang of it and understand this is what you need to do, thumbnails, especially something simple like that, few second thumbnail is not uncommon. So that's something to keep in mind when you're trying to do your thumbnail. This is not to be stressed about getting things right or correctly describing form right off the get-go. Is just to understand, rather, do you want to position it this way, or perhaps you want to position it I don't know, perhaps, I'm not saying you should go like that. We're gonna still have quite a bit of breathing space around our shoe, so don't crop it, please. But thumbnails are the stage where you can make those kind of decisions. Same angle, we see everything the same, but instead, now in this case, we created a totally different effect by simply zooming in and cropping it, right? Also, at this stage, you can probably move the object around if you want it to look more interesting or something like that. So I'm gonna get rid of this so they're not throwing anyone off. All right, I'm gonna work with 0.5 for the most part. Feel free to use both 0.5 and 0.8 interchangeably, whatever you decide. And maybe some of this darker lines, pencil lines, I'm gonna kind of loosen them up a bit so they're not throwing me off, and also so that I'm not too attached to them. And just begin rendering from upper left this way if you're righty, and vice versa if you're lefty. Just very slowly trying to block in the shape that you see before starting to actually do any hatching itself. Just focus on the shapes and very slowly describe the shape without heavily relying on the initial rough sketch underneath. So I'm just trying to essentially locate everything. I got those, not sure what they're called, those little, I guess, I don't know if it's rivets or shoelace holes, but those metal clips that they put around the actual shoelace holes, whatever they're called. they're actually highly reflective. So I'm gonna keep that in mind as I move along, but that's just something that I've noticed right now, and that will be useful when I arrive there. So I'm just gonna block in as closely as I can. Some more pronounced and larger shapes, you can say. Instead of worrying about all the small details, I'm just blocking in the biggest shapes right now, because that is going to be my launching pad towards successful and accurate execution of all the other smaller shapes that are enclosed within the larger shapes. So like, for instance, in this case with my sneaker here, the bill is very a large shape. It helps me also understand the proportions of different shapes within the cuts, the other cuts, fake leather, faux leather, whatever you call those, various sections of the shoe. And you can also notice at which speed I am going here. Right now, no shading pretty much whatsoever, mostly simply outlining different enclosures to the best of my ability, exactly the same way we did with the continuous line study with that helmet in class. When in doubt, I slow myself down a little bit. I'm not trying to rush here, which is why we have plenty of time, and notice where everything is in space and how they're related. I'm constantly analyzing. Obviously, I'm not doing it so much consciously anymore, but I am nonetheless analyzing where every different shape ends and how they relate in space to each other. So like this little guy and this little guy on the same eye level for me. And then I noticed the angles of different shapes. So this bill kind of goes up this way, the bottom section of it. I notice the proportions. If you're in doubt and not sure, you can measure with the pencil measuring tool we've learned in the classroom before we went into the lockdown mode. So there's this little label that travels right across the front of this section. So I'm just gonna kind of block that label in. For now, I'm not gonna actually go into any detail, just so that I remember to leave some room for it, and I'm slowing myself down where I'm trying to go along with the actual form of the fabric of that little label. All right, and then blocking in some shape on the back, making sure I leave room for my shoelace here. Shoelaces are probably going to be the trickiest for most of us, just simply because there's a lot of them and there's a lot of bending and folding going on amongst them. So the form shifts quite a bit. So with the shoelaces, the best thing you guys can do is to really slow yourself down. Don't rush through them. Don't stress out too much. Just follow, just see where each shape folds into the next shape, and you'll be fine. So even with my experience, I don't really know exactly how to draw them right off the top of my head. So I'm trying to slow myself down quite noticeably here, and have a little bit of room for correction here, noticing all the angles of different folds and how the form behaves going through those different changes. Things that can help here is that noticing how certain sections of the shoelaces perhaps more parallel to each other. So when you're trying to describe certain areas like this guy and this guy, they actually there's a sort of an intuitive sense here that they are parallel. So this guy's, because they're sitting on top of this shoe cut, and this guy's are essentially crisscross, but they somewhat parallel to each other. And that's one little observation that I just had during my process of rendering it here. Okay, shoot changes slightly here. I'm gonna leave a little bit of that thickness here of the fabric that goes through the middle. That's that actual leather, I believe. The cut of the actual leather. And if you're in doubt and if you have a hard time seeing certain areas with your eye, feel free to move around and kind of get closer on the object, so you can, as we did in class with the longest study, so you can really understand how that shape travels, because sometimes it's hard to see or understand what's happening, areas like where it's too many different forms happening for your eye to really discern. It is totally normal. In fact, I encourage everybody to shift around, get up close to your object and get an idea of how that form actually behaves before you proceed if you're in doubt. My shoelace right here, actually what's gonna happen is that it bends, so it's coming out of this little rivet or whatever it's called, still don't know. It's going sort of upward, but then it bends into this little loop. So this is just a small discovery I made here. I block in those shapes that indicate that bend, and then I get closer to that transition edge and very slowly, no rush here, just kind of push the value down behind the bend. And even with that minor touch, we already starting to see a bit of a three-dimensionality happening. Contrast again is important. Notice simply where each of that shape, how the light behaves around it, and get that transition edge contrast that we talked about. It's coming, there's another part of the shoelace that's coming out of that same loop, going under, and then this guy actually connects going into the next shoelace hole. So slowing down everything that I'm observing right now is what's dark and what's light, to accentuate, to give that metal piece that three-dimensional form that it deserves. So very slowly trying to get that roundness accentuated. It's like a bend in form here in the fabric, and then a lot darker on the background. So I'm gonna block it in because I have limited space. It pretty much entirely looks like it's completely black there. And then maybe a little gradation here. How do we show texture? So a good way to mention texture is gonna be following all the other forms that we see. So using the example of the fabric of the shoelace itself, because that's got a little bit of that overlapping zigzaggy texture to the actual fabric itself. Again, same thing applies. Try to kind of go with the form and mimic the direction of the fabric texture that you notice, and it's gonna follow the form in the same way. So the light is my light source is coming from over here, right? I have a bit of a diffuse light, so it's not a very sharp direct light. So my light is essentially hitting the shoe right through here, as you see in this reference photo. That kind of indicates my eye level and my angle at which I'm looking at this still life. So the texture is gonna follow the same light logic. So for instance, to use this section right here as an example, what's happening here is that this shoelace that goes over the top of this bend, right? The light, because this is the bend right here, the light starts to transition into that same core shadow that you would see in something like a cylinder or something like a sphere or something like that. So I'm just trying to kind of follow the texture a little bit, mimicking the stitching or the fabric itself, and I'm alternating the density of the mark making, because this is the bend and the light essentially reaches this point. This is where it's highlighted the most, and then on this side it's going to be slightly more shadowed overall, except for some of the different bends of the shoe where it's still facing the light source in a more direct way. So just to kind of, I'm gonna try to speed up myself slightly just so I don't lose you guys completely. I'm gonna lock in. This goes over here. You don't have to always exert very strong pressure on the pen from every stroke when you're trying to outline something. So you could potentially kind of move around without actually pressing at first. So move around, like if you are following that form, if you're trying to find that form, once you kind of get a sense of where it's gonna go, then you can press a little bit harder on your nib. That's again that bend, right? Gonna be a little darker here on that transition where the core shadow begins. This shoelace right here is actually very interesting because it bends this way, right? As you can see in the photograph. So it's gonna be, I'm trying to follow the form again, and this is all I'm trying to do. Even through this bends here, moving away from the light source, but following the shoelace, slight transition through here, pushing down the value of the shoelace that's right here behind. Because it's farther away from the source, it's much darker. I'm constantly comparing everything and the surrounding values, and it is much darker than the front of the shoe where the light hits most of the surfaces in a more direct kind of way. I'm gonna push the back of this little shoe hole down so that this guy stands up and create that contrast. It's a little bit more challenging whenever it's details like reflective surface, so don't stress yourself out too much with those. Okay, lock this in real quick, and the shape goes in here, much darker behind that shoelace. Nice, begin to see the back of the shoe slightly, because it's an old shoe with lots of, it's a little deformed by this point. Noticing these guys are all pretty much spread out evenly, which is another little hint for me to where I should place it. Just to reiterate, it's a great idea to just try to draw whatever mundane, simple objects you may find around your house, outside, not something large, but even if it's like a car or something that's got a lot of character, a lot of change of form within it, is going to be a great object to practice on, to draw from life. And you see I kind of slow down here because I'm not entirely certain how that form behaves, and trying to make sure I describe it as accurately as I can. It kind of goes in there from where I'm sitting. So by shifting the angle at which you're looking at your still life composition, you can kind of give your entire work a little bit more interest. You can shift the way you look at it to give maybe certain areas a little bit more form, more definition, which you were previously not able to see. So I'm gonna block in the shoelace that's kind of lying down there on the surface. It's going behind like so, and then bends like through here. And as you can see, it's a lot darker on the back, so it's not going to be as detailed, which is why I have a little bit more artistic freedom here to play around, and I'm not so clinging to describing it 100% accurately. So I have a little bit more room to play with this section here, as opposed to something that requires a little bit more attention, especially if your goal is to describe it somewhat realistically, right? Again, this guy goes underneath this guy. I notice that as I try to arrive at that section, and slowly, and this shoelace goes into here. Not everything is going to be super detailed. Some areas, as I mentioned in the warm-up, are just going to be a little bit more obscured, and that is okay. You can unify certain areas by shading across that whole section, and that's how your eye is going to begin to see the form within it. And just to kind of give a hint at some texture that's going on. Maybe you can even, instead of individual marks like that, you could again unify this entire area and then go back in with fewer marks across to imitate that texture of the shoelace, packing them in a way that would kind of mimic the gradual transition of light to dark, right? Top of the shoelace facing a lot more light, hence that part of the shoelace is going to be the brightest. Just to kind of give you an example of what a shoelace is, if you completely simplify that to my earlier point about everything is actually being a more complex variation of simple geometric shapes. Any kind of fold of leather, anything, fabric, shoelaces, if you really dissect it and get it to the most basic shape, the shoelace is just a rectangle, essentially. It's just a three-dimensional shape that, instead of being this very thin, right, instead of being simply stiff, sort of a right shape with straight edges, such as like a rectangular sort of block, right? So think of it as a squished square, if you want to think of it that way. Essentially, the shoelace is just that, but it's more malleable. So now it, depending on where that light is located in relationship to that shoelace, now you have the same shoelace that behaves in this particular case like that, for instance. And not only it bends along across the length of it, it also bends because it's also fabric. It also bends, right, this way and this way. So width, length, and how you want to conceptualize it for yourself, it can bend in many multiple ways. So now we have a shoelace that can bend even like that, right? But it does still have a bit of a thickness, as opposed to something that would be similar, like maybe a ribbon. Just gonna end it here. So it's the same shape, but now you gotta think in terms of how that value behaves across that shape. And if this guy is now positioned more, this edge is more positioned towards the light, that means the light's gonna hit hardest here, then it's gonna start moving upwards with a bit of a gradual shading here. Again, hard light. Don't forget about, obviously, that perspective and things foreshortening as they move away from us when you're doing even something as small as a shoelace. But essentially, a shoelace is just a more complex version of a simple geometric object. With that said, going back to here, just to continue with the demo. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so kind of got a little distracted. There's some stitching going on after the third one. I'm gonna suggest it just to keep that in mind so I don't mess it up, because I do want to preserve quite a bit of detail here. There's gonna be another, oh, well, okay, I messed up my proportions, but that's all right. It's just gonna be a wonkier shoe. I'm gonna go over some of the shapes in my attempt to correct myself slightly. So be mindful when you placing your simple objects onto different surfaces that bend in space, because they will obviously start appearing flattened or otherwise affected by that foreshortening. So just trying to block in some shadows that are casted onto the inner parts here, following the form to the best of my ability. And just some areas, as I mentioned in the warm-up, you don't have to always follow the form. Follow the form is just a main general rule, especially for things that are not as obscured as maybe some sections of the shoe that are not so much revealed or facing that light source. Another thing to keep in mind when we're working with something like a shoelace that has already some texture in it is to imagine a more simplified shape, perhaps within that larger, more complex shape. So just to give you an example, if we could kind of imagined that this shoe is just half a cylinder, that will help us to kind of understand how the light travels around that basic geometric shape in the simplest way. So if the light is coming this way, for how I set up my composition, from slightly top left in the front, And the top of the shoe is nothing but kind of a cylinder, or think of it as, right, we just used half of the cylinder. It starts to become slightly darker as it travels away from the light source. So I just sliced through here, and that's how I got this. So with that kind of understanding of what is underneath this more complex shape, you can also begin to see how the other shape, such as a shoelace, as I showed you in this little sketch, right, how that wraps around another shape, such as the cylinder here, within the environment with this light, meaning that it's receiving the most light here, like that's the highlight. Then it's becoming slightly darker as it moves away from the light source, and in that band is where that's going to be the darkest, right there, or that's already traveled to the other side. It's traveled to the other side of the cylinder, right? So once you kind of understand that, then you can also add to your shading. You can add things like texture. So you begin to kind of lay out a few marks that are suggesting some kind of texture. That is what the fabric itself, the tactile quality of the fabric, right? That slightly thickness here that's receiving more light. In this case, it's receiving less light. So I'm actually gonna darken that and create a slight transition, because it's not a box, it's not a sharp edge. So as you can see, I left the top of that bill, or whatever it's called, that part of the shoe, I don't know what it's called, slightly lighter, because it's receiving a little bit more light. And then I mimicked the thickness of the shoelace by pushing down some of the value right there through that little section. Same thing here, I'm just gonna create a bit of a separation. During the time when I didn't realize my phone actually stopped recording, I kind of rendered this form to show you what you can do with that thickness that I talked about in here, but also keeping in mind that it bends in various directions, where you can do things like this, where this part is receiving less light, and then this part receiving less light. And simply by alternating how light or dark something appears, you begin to create a three-dimensional feel to something as simple as this. Essentially, same thing here with the shoelace. We are just slowly pushing down the values and adding some texture that wraps around and also complies with the overall light logic, right? There's some ridges here in the shoe, as you can see. I'm just gonna establish some marks here to go around. Not gonna count them or stress myself with exact number or anything like that. This is gonna be the toughest part for me, because these ridges, I may not actually render all of them perfectly, because it's just gonna take me 2 hours to actually render all this texture that's present through this part that kind of looks like a car tire almost, with the bit of a tread. So instead, I'm just gonna try to simplify the way I describe it. I notice it's just a bunch of squares essentially laying over. So in order for me to translate it into my drawing, I notice about 2 marks here are the width of each square. So I'm just gonna approximately lay down a few marks to establish that size relationship, and then go back in and make sure that, again, 2 marks in the top part of the shoe, and kind of overlap it by following the overall form of the shoe. It's kind of rubbed out here, so I'm gonna keep that character there. So I'm gonna only wrap around here, just like so. If you're really meticulous and you really look at each of these sections, each of these little guys, again, to use the help of my sticky notes, with this little thread, what's happening, right, is, actually, let me tape it like that. This thread is little squares that have a concave sort of top to them. So if we broke it down, light's coming again from over here, and if it was an actual square positioned that way, it would look something like this, right? Obviously, I'm not drawing a full square. I'm drawing kind of a squished square here in this case. But light's hitting the top, right? That's the simple shape. Now, these guys are actually maybe more of, first of all, they're rotated about 45 degrees if you really broke it down. So now we have this shape is the smaller shape here, but now we have ridges to it. So we have a flat surface here that's kind of away from the light slightly, and the most light is going to be received by this surface on top. So I'm going to shade across this surface slightly, right? This guy right down there is also shaded because it's going inward and it's not receiving that much light. Get it closer to that transition edge. Leave this guy untouched for now, and with the same, if you are to continue rendering these guys precisely, this is what you're gonna notice. This guy is the darkest because it's turned away from the light source even more, like so, and this one perhaps slight gradation towards the top plane. This is now being registered by the brain as an actual, shape within the same environment with the same light source and light logic. And if you continued rendering each of those shapes, it's just gonna start looking like part of the unified whole. But going back to my earlier point about the cylinder, every object can be just boiled down to the basic geometric shape at its core. I'm gonna take away these guys. So with that in mind, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go over here and just quickly block out the main planes, these guys right here, leaving slightly highlighted on top, and that will give us enough information to read this as a part of the pattern of the little thread here that Converse is known for. Some sections, again, with these ridges, same thing. Notice how the light behaves around, wrapping around each of these thicknesses, each of these shapes, and try to imitate it to the best of your ability. Some areas where it's not so much precision, you can even go a little bit more expressive with your mark making. So instead of keeping everything parallel like so, you can potentially go slightly more gestural and get a few more squiggly lines in areas that don't require as much attention to detail to create that variation. The way I'm kind of doing here, because I don't want everything to be super rendered. So I'm just kind of getting a little bit more creative with fewer lines here, and I'm gonna again go across a few of the shapes real quick. All right, guys, so I decided to speed up this part of the process because I'm kind of repeating myself at this point. But basically, the key things that I want you to keep in mind while working on the study is to slow yourself down. When you're in doubt, really observe the value of your still life, in this case, the shoe study, and just follow the form. Really, if I was to leave you with only one insight, that would be following the form, because if you follow the form, your marks are gonna essentially outline that object, whether it's a flat surface or whether it's something as complex as the shoe, and the contrast between the direction of various lines that you're gonna create by simply following that form, that curvature of shapes essentially, is what's going to create that visual interest and give you enough differentiation between various areas of your drawing and separate visually certain parts of it so that you can then begin to see depth and actually distinguish this as a shoe and not just as a uniformly shaded object of sort. And lastly, I wanted to add one more thing, is that we will be working within half of our drawing pad, just to cut down on time, since this is a pen and ink and it's a little bit more demanding on building that value with cross-hatching. So I don't want anybody working on the 18 by 24 format, because it's going to take you way longer. But just to be clear, I don't want you guys to shove your shoe in the corner of that half of the format, as I've seen a few people kind of not utilizing the new format. Please either cut your paper into the new 12 by 18 just by doing quick math here, or you're gonna be folding it at the very least. But I think cutting it and making sure that you're working within the new proportions is what I'd like to see, because I want to see how you compose your shoe within that new format, within the new proportions of the paper. Don't go too large, don't go too small. I don't want you to be zoomed in to the point where you ended up pushing the edges of your object all the way to the edge of the paper, but also, don't leave too much space around. So your shoe is going to be somewhere around the same size that I had in this demo, probably around 10 inches or so length at the longest. So be mindful when you compose it, and be mindful of this requirement when you begin with your quick thumbnail sketches before you go into the light pencil sketch in your larger format. All right, that's all I'm going to leave you with, and let me know if you have any questions. I'm within quick reach of a text or an email, and I'll try to respond as soon as I can. And if you guys need more of my feedback, I'll be happy to give you guys a call, or we can connect over a video chat, or whatever else I can do in this situation to give you extra help. I am more than happy to do that. With that said, I hope you guys have fun with this study, enjoy it, and good luck.